Riverpod is not only about providing objects around the app. It comes bundled and closely integrated with StateNotifier, which is a state management class. It resembles the default Flutter's ValueNotifier or even Cubit from the Bloc package without the underlying streams. This kind of immutable state management is just great for keeping unpleasant surprises at bay. Hello, welcome to ResoCoder, where we are getting prepared for real app development so that you will get freelance clients or a job and be confident about the apps you build. So subscribe and hit the bell to join us on our quest for becoming in-demand Flutter developers. It's become quite of a habit over here on ResoCoder to demonstrate different state management solutions by writing the very same simple weather forecast app. And since the template by which we demonstrate different state management solutions is always the same, you can nicely compare apples to apples because the end result is always the same. So this tutorial will be no different. We are going to demonstrate StateNotifier by building this kind of an app, which you may have seen already in some of my other videos. So basically we just input a city, London, search for it, and it's going to output this simple weather forecast of some sorts. And it can also perhaps output an error, which in the finished app is actually going to show a snack bar at the bottom saying that some error occurred. I do have a starter project ready for you so that you can follow along with this tutorial and not have to write all of the sort of unnecessary code which needs to be there in order for this app to function properly, but it has nothing to do with StateNotifier or Riverpod per se. Also, this tutorial assumes that you understand at least the basics of working with Riverpod, so if you want to catch up on that, you can check out the tutorial from the card in the corner. So, if you want to get this code, be sure to check out the written tutorial from the link in the video description, where also apart from the starter project, you can find all of the code written in this video, links to the libraries, and overall go through this lesson at your own pace. So the starter project, which you can get from the written tutorial from the link in the description, contains a weather model. It consists of a city name and a temperature in Celsius. Then we also have a weather repository, which simply has one function called fetchWeather, which simply returns the weather model, which is randomly generated. The temperature is randomly generated, and the city name, well, this comes from the inputted city name, which is inputted by the user. And then also we have preparation for the user interface, which we will implement with StateNotifier, as you can see here. But we basically have all of the different states that the app can be in, represented by these methods. So build initial input will show this, build loading will show the circular progress indicator, then we have build column with data, which will show the successfully gotten data, right? You should probably not write these kinds of widget returning functions inside of your own app, but instead create widget classes. But over here, we are doing this for simplicity. And as always, you can go through this at your own pace from the written tutorial if you want to really take a close look at this. So let's now go ahead and add the dependencies. Actually, there will not be multiple dependencies, but only one of them, and that is Flutter Riverpod, currently at version 0.12.1. So even though we are going to be using StateNotifier for state management, we need to import only Riverpod here because Riverpod comes bundled and it's also very closely integrated with StateNotifier, and that's great. Riverpod is therefore a truly complete state management solution because it not only provides the mechanisms to provide things around your app, such as provider, the regular provider does, but it also allows you to manage complex states. So Riverpod as opposed to Provider, in my opinion, is truly a fully fledged state management solution because it comes bundled with StateNotifier and it's also very closely integrated with it. Before going any further with our weather search app example, let's briefly talk about the principles of StateNotifier, shall we? So I'm going to write a very brief example here over in main.dart. StateNotifier is something like a Flutter independent value notifier. So let's demonstrate all of it on a class counter notifier for a brief demonstration. So Flutter has this default value notifier, which needs to be provided a type, which it then notifies about. As you can see, it comes directly from Flutter, and it's actually a specific sort of a change notifier, as you can see. And I'm sure you're all familiar with change notifier, at least. So value notifier int, right? And you would have a counter notifier constructor. You would call a super constructor, and this needs to be passed the initial value for the value notifier. And the initial value of our counter will be 0. The count starts at 0. And then we would have one void increment. And over here we would say value plus plus to increment it. Now we can do this incrementation just because it's an integer, the value is an integer, but if the value was something different, you would say value equals, and the new value, in this case value plus 1, to be more verbose, right? So this is all possible with default Flutter. Nothing special was used here. Everything comes from the Flutter framework itself. But StateNotifier is a bit better in the sense that it's independent of Flutter. You can use it also outside of Flutter projects, and it's also a bit quicker and a bit safer because the value, which is called state, by the way, in StateNotifier, is protected. You cannot access it from outside of the class. Because over here, for example, if we instantiate a counter notifier, we would be able to access the value and also set it like this, right? This is not cool. We should not be able to set the value from outside. That's actually quite bad. And StateNotifier prevents this. See, the value notifier's value is just totally public. There is no way to prevent it being set from outside of the class. So let's migrate to StateNotifier. StateNotifier int. We need to import Flutter Riverpod. Nothing changes except that the value is now called state. So state plus 1. And also, whenever we try to set the state value from outside of the class, we get this squiggly line below saying that the member state can only be used within instance members of subclasses, blah, blah, blah. Now, this is only an info message at this point, but as a good Flutter developer, you can always change the severity of an info message to, for example, be an error. And if you want to learn how to do this, you can check out the tutorial from the card in the corner about linting in Dart. But the good thing is here that you are really protected from this kind of a silliness of a code when you set the state from outside of the class with StateNotifier. All right, that's enough for the simple counter notifier example. Oh, and also just so that you know, if you have not used, for example, the value notifier previously, whenever you set the state, all of the listeners of the state notifier, as you can see here, are notified about the state change. This is quite important. So now we can move away from the simple counter notifier example and jump right into our weather forecast app. Over here, having a single integer for a state just doesn't cut it. So whenever a state is complex, for example, consisting of multiple subclasses or a freezed union, you should write code for that state first and only then worry about the logic. So we are going to do just that. We're going to create the state classes, which are going to represent the state of the app first, and only then worry about the state notifier. So let's create a new folder, application. That's how we categorize things around here, because state notifier is, by my terms, which I have outlined in the domain-driven design tutorial series, a part of the application layer. But that's not too important for this kind of a simple tutorial. So we're going to create a file ValueNotifier.dart. This is where both the state notifier and the state classes are going to live. So ValueNotifier. And what kind of classes should we have here? Well, we are going to be asynchronously loading a single resource, which is the weather model. And in such occasions, it's quite simple to represent the state. I'm just going to paste the classes in here so that I don't bore you, but you can always get the code from the link in the video description from the written tutorial. So at first, we need to have the abstract class weather state from which each other of the classes is going to inherit. And again, you can also use freezed unions in your real life projects, but here we are not using freezed because I do not want to bog you down with just another library, in order to keep this focused on the state notifier itself. Then next is weather initial for displaying just the text input like this. Then yet another state is weather loading. It's again very simple. It extends weather state and it has just a simple constant constructor. And now we're getting into the interesting stuff, which is weather loaded, right? This now has the weather model field inside of it, and it also overrides equality. And lastly, weather error, for whenever a bad thing happens, we get an exception. We need to have a weather error class in order so that we can display the snack bar about the error. So these are the states which we need in order to represent all of the possible states which the app can be in. So again, these are weather initial, weather loading, weather loaded, and weather error. And now with these states fully modeled, we can move over to implementing our state notifier, which is going to be called ValueNotifier. So let's create a class, ValueNotifier, and it's going to extend state notifier, which will operate on a weather state. With this is the abstract class. Now, we will want to get the weather from the weather repository. So we need to have a final weather repository field. Let's make it package private weather repository. Let's add it to the constructor. Now this constructor also needs to invoke the super constructor of the state notifier subclass. And just like we've seen before, you need to pass in the initial state. So obviously in this case, it's going to be weather initial. And then we're also going to have a method in here. So it's going to be future void. And you should always make sure that your methods return void in state notifiers, because you don't want to return anything from the methods themselves. You only want to update the state. It's going to be called getWeather. It's going to accept a string, city name, and it's going to be asynchronous because we need to do the fake network calls. And let's at first say that state will be equal to weather loading. So as soon as this method is called, we want the app to show the circular progress indicator. That's why we set the state to be loading right from the start. Then we want to actually load the weather. So let's say await weather repository dot fetch weather and pass in the city name. We want to store the returned value from this method call inside of a final weather. And then once we have this weather successfully loaded, we're going to set the state to be weather loaded and pass in the weather. Now, in order to also output weather error, we need to put this code inside a try catch statement, because over here we need to catch the exception, or actually only one exception, so we can say on network exception, which is a class coming from the starter project. And whenever a network exception happens, we can output the following state. State is equal to weather error and some nice message. So let's say something like couldn't fetch weather, is the device online. With this, we have just again implemented the weather notifier. It will always update the state and UI will be able to react to these state changes. But before we can start implementing the UI, we first need to implement the providers so that we can actually get this weather notifier class into the UI and also to subscribe to the state changes from the UI. So we're going to create a new file in the root of the lib folder called providers.dart. And inside of it, we need to first have a provider for the weather repository. So let's create final weather repository provider is equal to provider. Weather repository is the type. And it will pass us a reference, which we actually will not use here. And we are going to instantiate a concrete instance of the weather repository abstract class, which in this case is the fake weather repository. So let's do just that. Fake weather repository will be instantiated. And let's also import Riverpod here. Cool, so this is the first provider. The second one will be final weather notifier provider. And this one will be a state notifier provider. This one is closely integrated with the state notifier, which is nice to see. It's going to pass us again the reference. And this time we are actually going to use the reference because we want to instantiate a weather notifier, which needs to get a weather repository passed into it. And we can get the weather repository by calling ref.watch and watch weather repository provider, this one. With these providers implemented, we can now hop into the user interface. So just like with every other Riverpod project, we need to wrap the whole app inside a provider scope. So let's wrap the material app inside main.dart with provider scope. And we're good to go. Now, as you could see at the beginning of this video where I showcase you the finished app, we have these methods which we need to call on certain states. And to rebuild the UI whenever the state changes, we are going to use the consumer widget, which you are familiar with already from my previous tutorial about Riverpod. So right here where we say implement with StateNotifier, we are going to set the child to be a consumer, and the builder will be a function which will watch the weather notifier provider, but not this notifier in itself, but actually something which is a field on this provider, and that's a state, or actually it's a property. This state is an entire provider in itself. As you can see, the ValueNotifier provider, which we have written ourselves, is a StateNotifier provider. But this state property, which is present inside of it, is a StateNotifier state provider. This is very handy because this StateNotifier state provider, which is automatically present inside any kind of a StateNotifier provider, will automatically cause the UI to rebuild when you watch it whenever the state changes. So that's awesome. We're going to put the watched state into final state. And now we're just going to check through all of the possible states and build the appropriate UI. So I'm actually not going to bore you with this. I'm just going to paste it from the written tutorial, to which you can get from the link in the video description. So let's import the ValueNotifier.dart file. And basically, if state is initial, we build initial input. If state is loading, we build loading. If it's loaded, we build column with data and pass in the state.WeatherModel. And if the state is weather error, so else, we build just the initial input. But here is the thing. Whenever there is an error coming from the StateNotifier, we want to show a snack bar. But where can we put this code to show a snack bar? Well, anything that should be run only once when the state is updated has just absolutely no place inside of any kind of a build method. That's because the build method can run many times over. But we want to show only one snack bar in the precise moment when the state updates to error. But when the state is already weather error, but for some reason the build method is run again, we just do not want to show yet another snack bar. And this doesn't apply only to snack bars, but also to navigating and also any kind of side effects you may have inside of your UI code. But if that wasn't enough, also showing a snack bar inside of a build method will result in an error. So basically we have no option than to find a different solution for showing a snack bar. Thankfully, that kind of a solution is here, and it's called a provider listener. It's a widget, and we are going to, for example, wrap the consumer with it. So it's provider listener, and it accepts a provider. And we are again going to specify ValueNotifier provider, and again it's state, which is the StateNotifier state provider. And it also has a onChange method, which passes us a context and the value, which we are actually going to call state. And now we can check if state is weather error. We're going to show a snack bar. So this is the simple, usual code for showing a snack bar right here. So just like that, a snack bar will be shown by calling scaffold of context show snack bar. There is still one thing left here, and we actually also have a to-do all the way at the bottom, and that is that we need to actually call the getWeather method on the ValueNotifier whenever a city name is submitted from the UI. So let's do just that. As usual with Riverpod's providers, we are going to call context.read, and we want to read a ValueNotifier provider, but this time we are not going to read the state, but just the ValueNotifier provider itself. That's kind of obvious because we are not interested in the state of the ValueNotifier. We are interested in the notifier itself because we want to call getWeather on it and pass in the city name from the UI. Now we can actually run the app and test it manually to see if it works properly. And it seems it does. So we can input a city, my city, Košice. Let's see. Works. Then, I don't know, let's say London again. And London could not be fetched, so we got an error, and also a snack bar was shown at the bottom. As you can see, and just for third time's the charm, or how do you say it in English? Let's say Warsaw, and it works. And just like that, you have finished a real-world app using the Riverpod plus StateNotifier combo for state management. It's effective, immutable, and clean, so what more can you wish for? Now, to go through this tutorial at your own pace once again, and to also get all of the code, check out the read tutorial available from the card in the corner. And if you are serious about becoming a great Flutter developer who can build real apps for clients or at a job, go to flutter.education, a link is also in the video description by the way, to get the top curated Flutter news and resources aimed at improving your app development career. Over there you can also subscribe to my mailing list to get the best Flutter resources delivered weekly right into your inbox. And if you don't want to miss more tutorials like this, be sure to subscribe to this channel and also join the notification squad by hitting the bell button to make sure you grow your Flutter skills, because here on ResoCoder I am determined to provide you with the best tutorials and resources so that you will become an in-demand Flutter developer. If this video helped you with understanding the Riverpod and StateNotifier combo, give it a like and also share it with other developers who are surely going to find this state management solution beneficial too. Leave a comment if you have anything to say, and see you in the next video.